But with that, I'm particularly excited to kick off the day with also somebody I think that almost all the developers in the audience will have used in one form or another. We have Scott Chacon, the co-founder of GitHub, which is, I think, a product that's used by, well, I guess like 98% plus of all developers. So it's really, really amazing. And he is now co-founding another company, GitButler, that is still in stealth, so I'm not quite sure, but we might get like some sneak peeks at what he's working at and what he's thinking about, like how the next generation version control looks like. Yeah, and I mean, he has been like having an amazing story, starting this company and then growing it to 450 plus people over 8 years, and then obviously to an exit at Microsoft for 7.5 billion. He's published many books, pro-Git, so many of you might have learned from his published books on like how to use Git properly. And we're gonna have a talk that both covers like kind of like the founding and how he built all of this, as well as the technical aspects like what's the future of AI and software development gonna hold. So with that and without further ado, I all ask you to give a super warm welcome for our first keynote and fireside chat, Scott Chacon.
How's everybody doing after the after parties last night? We're okay? You all made it here. I thought there was going to be 4 people here. Fantastic.
I can like, to warm things up about after party, I think Scott tried to be a responsible speaker yesterday and go home, but on the way of the hotel we just like stumbled upon him and just like
turned me right around.
Said like, yeah, do you want to have another whiskey? So that was like very easy to convince him. So Scott has also had a chance to see a little bit of Cluj. So before we go into all the technical things, what's your first impression about Cluj and the ecosystem and the people that you've seen here as you've spent now like 1.5, 2 days here?
Yeah, I mean it's been fantastic. I've been to Cluj a couple of times before, but yeah, I mean it was funny because I forgot at first that Romania is in the EU but does not use the euro and is not in Schengen. So I kind of forgot that when I was coming in. But the city's beautiful, and I've been sort of trying to walk around. We did a satellite event last night, so I got to walk around downtown and kind of through the big park and stuff, and it was fantastic. I had a satellite event last night and was walking home from that, and I was like, I'm going to be, like you said, responsible and go to bed and get some rest for the talk. And then I saw this big party happening in the park, and I was like, I think it's a wedding. I'm going to crash the wedding. Like, this is how many beers I had had before that. I was like, time to crash a wedding. And I go over there, and I was like, actually, this is the after party that I was originally invited to. So that's not. But then you saw me, and you're like, let's go to another place. So yeah, but it's been fantastic.
All right. Cool, so let's dive right into your early days in GitHub, right? Like, so you started with, I believe, like 4 people originally, and obviously scaled the team quite big. So what were you seeing back in the day when you thought like, hey, this is something we should really like create? What was like the founding moment or thing that got you thinking like, hey, we need to really create like GitHub around like the Git project?
Yeah, so at the time, I was working at a company where we were using Git in sort of a strange way. We were using it to move assets from one computer to multiple computers. And Git really, it's a version control system, but the heart of it is really a content distribution network system. So we were using it in this weird way, and I had to learn sort of the internals. And that's why I ended up sort of writing a bunch of books on it, because it was so interesting to me. And most people just kind of memorize a couple of command lines and do that. And I was more interested in the internals, kind of how Git worked. I found it really fascinating, and I still do. I still abuse it in lots of different ways. But I was going to meetups, and I met a couple of guys who were working on open source. Like one of the most important things that I think that I did in my early career is go to lots of meetups and meet lots of people and be involved in the open source community, because everybody loved what they were doing, right? Like, people were doing it not because they were getting paid to do open source stuff, but because just the love of building things, right, and sharing with people. And I really enjoyed that, and I met people who were trying to build a better sort of Git host, because there weren't a lot of good ones around at the time, And I got involved with them because I was the Git guy. Every little Ruby meetup in San Francisco that I went to, I was always talking about Git and I'm implementing Git in these different languages and stuff because I just found it so interesting. And it just kind of moved from there. So it started as this side project, and I think what's funny about my journey through with GitHub is that none of us started it to start a big company or to raise VC or none of us imagined that we would have this huge exit or anything like that. That's not why we started the business. We really didn't, I think none of us were like, okay, we want to start some huge company around this. And we were told by lots of people that the market cap for software development tools like this was relatively low because they were looking at companies like SourceForge and things that existed at the time. But yeah, they wanted to build something. We all, I joined them to help a lot with the Git stuff, and we were, I think, a good team. But it didn't really rocket ship, right? Like it was 4 of us for almost a year, and we all kind of quit our jobs at the same time. It started as a side project. We all kind of quit our jobs because people were paying for it, and we were like, okay, well, it seems like this might be a thing, so maybe we can actually make a living off of this. And we quit, and we took huge pay cuts, actually, most of us from the professional jobs that we had. And started, kind of building that back up. And we didn't hire anybody else for probably a year, right? We bootstrapped the company, and then we just kept building it where, about a year later, we had enough revenue where we were like, okay, this isn't beer money and bad salaries anymore. This is, real money that's coming in, and so we can hire another person and another person. And every month or two, we look at how much revenue we were making and kind of divide that by 12 and be like, okay, I think this is enough for one more developer, and we'd hire another developer that we knew, sort of out of our personal networks, out of the open source community. And it just grew and grew and grew and grew like that, and kind of, for 4 open source developers that never run a business before and like didn't get into it by like, we're going to build this big business and grow it. It was kind of getting out of hand, and so yeah, we ended up raising VC money at some point, but not on purpose. It was more just the VCs were coming to us, trying to get in. They were like, how is this company that's used by all of our portfolio companies not taken any VC yet, right? Like, I want to be the first check-in, and we kind of had them fight it out. We were like, convince me why we should take your money, right? Which was kind of a really interesting dynamic. But yeah, so that's kind of how it started, and we ran the company, and we started the company as an open source project internally. We tried to, we were all open source developers. We wanted to act more like an open source team, so we didn't have a lot of management. Everybody was kind of working on what they thought was most important, and we talked in chat. Like, we'd all be sitting around a table chatting to each other in Campfire, and not talking out loud to each other, right? And so that kind of moved into more remote work. Eventually, after we had like 8 or 9 employees, we were like, oh, we can probably have some remote employees because we're not talking to each other in person that much anyway. So that's kind of how it grew and how we became, I think, one of the first bigger remote, like 50, 60% remote companies, and kind of had to learn and invent a lot of things around remote work, a decade before sort of everybody was forced to with COVID. So yeah, it was a super interesting time.
What I really love is the takeaway that you said, right? Like, by contributing to an open source project, it's such a great way to sharpen your skills, because basically, like, you can learn from some of the best and most passionate people, because most of the time people start in open source not to make money, but just basically to do something cool. So you have like a certain caliber generally, like an open source project. So I love how you're like basically like put it out there, and then like one thing led to the other. So I do think it's a great career advice for people generally to contribute to open source.
Yeah, I've had a lot of junior people kind of ask me how to get in, especially people that will go to like coding boot camps or something, right? And they're like, okay, I have the basic skills. How do I find a job now, right? Because I haven't worked in a tech company before. And my advice is always to do open source, because it's such a great way. Like, you find a project that you're interested in, kind of this is the area, or this is the technology that excites me, that I'm interested in, and you can go in an open source project and start contributing and start building up sort of a reputation for exactly what you're interested. Like, is it a database, right? Is it a front end framework? Like, what do you like doing? And you contribute to the open source, and then when you do get a job, right, or when you do, you can meet people sort of in that community that work at companies and try to kind of get into those companies because they know you and they've worked with you, right? And you have this background. And I found that it's a really, really great way of building up a name and a reputation within the industry that you want to be in.
Yeah. So maybe let's continue on that line of like culture building within within GitHub, and I suppose you do the same thing. So how did you, like, back in the day when you looked for like great people that would be a fit for your team? What were you looking in, and were you like looking at people that have great like open source code, or were you looking at people that your team recommends, or how did you like look for people that were a great fit at GitHub?
Yeah, I mean, all of our early hires were open source contributors or contributors to projects that we were interested in or that we had open sourced, or used GitHub a lot, right, and kind of talked about it. But we met most of our early employees at conferences, because we'd go to Ruby conferences and they would be presenting on something that they were particularly passionate about, right? And a lot of times they'd have like a GitHub URL at the end, and so we would become friends with them and approach them and work with them on projects, and then eventually try to steal them, right, and hire them into, once we had enough money, we'd be like, okay, who would be great for the next sort of set of problems that we have? And we had people in mind, right, that we knew cared about these things, knew were passionate about them, knew were good at them, we could look at their code, we had worked with them before, and we would try to convince them to come join us. And it was relatively easy, I think, compared to a lot of jobs, because we were working on something that was a developer tool and trying to get developers to work on it. And to convince a developer this is going to be a fun job, right? This is kind of why I did it, is because I was making more money before, and I didn't really think about this as, okay, it's going to be a $7 billion company or something that never crossed any of our minds, even like years in, right? But I love doing it. I was so excited. I remember my first time downloading the GitHub source code that Chris and Tom were working on, and thinking, how much fun is this that I get to do this as a living, right? To work on my own problems and my own workflows, and so yeah, that was relatively easy for us to be able to say, hey, come and work on tools that open source developers use in this open source manner, and it was very exciting for people.
Yeah, I mean, I bet, right, like this is like a time where you like really, you had this opportunity to like really once see the future of software development and in a significant way contribute. That I said, like, I mean, almost all of the developers here are gonna use nowadays what you created. So with that, I would love to talk a little bit like, is the next shift happening now, right? Like with like AI-assisted coding, and maybe as maybe not everybody here has a chance to try that yet. Can you share a little bit like what's currently like the state of the art of AI-enhanced programming, and where do you see that going? Like not only for Git, but just in general, like as a new paradigm for software development.
Yeah, so the way that I like to think about technology in software development is what makes your job easier, what removes friction, right? That was kind of always the thing that we looked at GitHub. We were always trying to be very opinionated about this is how we like to work and the easiest way that we think work should happen. And we really wanted to avoid becoming Jira, right? Like we didn't want to just add features and add features and add features and be like, we'll just solve every problem for everybody that comes to us and make the interface and the workflow really complicated, because then you can do anything in it, right? We wanted to say, what would be the nice way of working, and we'll be opinionated about that, and we'll make things as simple as possible. And so, like, it wasn't so much this is where we, think software development's going. We had an idea about how we liked to work and how to make that as easy as possible, and we built that and we kind of forced it on people, right? We were like, people would be like, it doesn't work well for this workflow, and we're like, then don't use that workflow. Like, I don't know what to tell you. And it's not a very common way of sort of building product, but I think it's a very powerful way of building product, of saying, we have a vision of how this is easy. And I think AI is the next wave of this, because for me, at least, I'm still an active software developer. I started, like you said, a new company, and so I'm in the code every day. I'm coding a lot again, where that kind of goes back. If you have a 450-person company, you're generally that nobody lets you touch the source code anymore. But now I'm doing that, and my workflow has changed so much in the last 6 months or so, since OpenAI came out, since Copilot came out, and because I use that instead of Stack Overflow, right, or instead of reading documentation. And for me, right now, I think it's more of a documentation thing of, I want to know how to do something, and instead of reading through a book or reading through documentation, I'll ask ChatGPT, or I'll write a comment and have Copilot sort of finish it for me and spot check it. But it ends up being much less research and much less typing than it used to be before. But the reason that it's valuable to me is not because the technology is technically interesting, but because it saves me time, right? Like it has a real effect and impact on my personal workflow and on my productivity. And so I can see where that goes, or I think it's relatively clear where that goes, right? That it takes over more and more of your typing, it takes over more and more of your research, and it becomes more about what do I want to accomplish with my code, and less about what are the actual individual lines that I'm writing. Like, I just need to know what the logic is and what I want the outcome to be, and I don't really care what the implementation is necessarily or what language it's in or anything. I care about, does this solve the problem that I want to do, and is it more efficient for the workflow that I have? So this is kind of where I at least see it going, right? Is moving towards more of a low-code sort of solutions of saying, I want to create a form that takes this information and processes it in this way and puts it in the database and shows the customer this, and you kind of explain that, and I think we'll get to the point where systems are starting to produce all of that for us, or even, like the AI systems are really interesting because the language models, what they're good at a lot of things that humans aren't good at, right? And vice versa. Humans are good at things that it's not good at, like some reasoning, right? And sort of logic. But where I see it going is more like taking advantage of the things that large language models are very good at, which is not necessarily being correct, but being able to be very productive, right? Like you can say, give me 100 implementations of this, that are all different about this, and test them all and give me the 3 that seem to work the best, and then I can choose that, and then we can go through this iteration over and over again. And I think that's where the future of software programming and open source really is, right? Is contributing to databases of how do I get a large language model to be fitted or to be, fine-tuned to the way where I can just be like, give me 1,000 of them and tell me what you think the best 3 are, right? And then, because human beings can't do that. And I mean, human beings can do that. Like if we got all of the software developers in this room and we gave them all the same problem, we'd get 100 different implementations that all solve the same problem, right? And so you can't, but one person can't do 15 implementations and then figure out which one they like the best at the end, right? So that's where I think it's going to go, and I think we'll start seeing tooling and sort of open source solutions that coalesce around that model, right, of what large language models are good at that human beings historically have not been. And I think it's very exciting and interesting and unpaved, right? I think GitHub is going to have to change a lot to take advantage of this, or to help with the Copilot tools or with whatever to help developers move along that route, or somebody else will come and do it better and people will switch over to that as a workflow tool.
Yeah, and I love, right, like the optimistic way how you frame it, right, like that, and that's why they call it like co-pilot, right, like the engineer, the developer is still the pilot of the plane, so he's making the decision and he's providing the brain power and intelligence, but now he has this, like what you said, like this almost unlimited amount of helpers that can like give him ideas and solutions, and then he can like pick and choose and see when to ask the right questions, right, like so that's the one thing that I really love, that it unlocks a new level of creativity. And whenever I've seen this in my career, right, like when new tools like mobile development, all this kind of stuff, web services, like some of these big paradigm shifts come available, then people build always like stuff that they just couldn't build before, or they couldn't build at scale, right? Like so now a 10-people team can build something that maybe before like a 20 or 50-people team could have built. And usually this is like a big unlock of like creativity and new things.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's been really the history of software development, right? Like it's, you kind of, if you go back to, punch cards or assembly or whatever, like everybody was kind of rebuilding the same tooling over and over, and open source really helps you not reinvent the wheel, right? And to be able to stand on the shoulders or stand on each other's shoulders and say, let's all kind of work on these generic solutions. And that's kind of what GitHub is, right? Like it's open source, it's a lot of libraries, it's a lot of, like if I start, I don't know, a website now as opposed to 20 years ago, I just go through and start taking in all the JavaScript, the node libraries or whatever that I need, and it solves 80% of the problems that I used to have to implement myself. And I think OpenAI is just kind of the next, or, LLMs are kind of the next stage of that, of these are all sort of problems that everybody's solved before, so help me start out there. And libraries are very heavyweight and large, right, as opposed to snippets or individual, functions and things like that, which is kind of the level that the LLMs are working at now. And I think a combination of that just makes it so that, like more and more, it's always kind of the way of software development is there's solutions and solutions and solutions that you can build off of and step on top of and then build something new. And that's really all that I think that we're looking at, right? Like, I don't think anybody's going to lose their jobs. I don't think AI or these tools are going to start putting people out of business. I think it will do what technology has always done, which is allow you to do more with less, right? Like, it's entirely a different proposition to build a website or to build a service or to build a company now than it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, 30 years ago. And 10 years from now, it's going to be fewer people or the same amount of people being able to do much, much more.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the right framework. There's still so many unsolved problems. So there's 100 times more problems than engineers in the world. So I don't think that any of us have to worry that we'll be like replaced anytime soon. But I want to ask you, right? Like, as you've like starting your new company, what are the things and the big problems in software development that you're particularly like keen to contribute solving with GitButler?
Yeah, I mean, so, you know, we started the company because I think this is actually a relatively good exercise for everybody to do, right? Like, not necessarily if you want to start a new company, but just to be aware of friction in your daily life, right? So is it, you know, getting a cab or something? You can invent something like Uber, right? Like, is it for me, it's Git, actually, because I've been working with this for a long time, and it hasn't changed very fundamentally in 15 years. And actually, before that, even the history of version control is still relatively similar. It's not massively different using like RCS 30 years ago than it is using Git on the command line today. A lot of the things that we use it for are the same. And so I liked this idea of looking at it and saying, in my workflow, what frictions do I have? How would I like to work? What are the things I'm working around Git in order to do? Because it's not about Git, it's not about the commands. It's about sharing code with each other. It's about reviewing code. It's about seeing what changes are. It's about working in individualized contexts that are sort of separated from each other and easy to manipulate separately, right? And so that's kind of what we're looking at. Well, like the beginning of it was thinking about version control fundamentally of, like, Google Docs, for example, or Dropbox Paper, whatever, does version control, but it does it massively differently than the way that Git does it, right? Like, you have to go to the command line and say, save this save point. In Google Docs, it's just constantly saving. Like, why does our version control system not do that, right? Or not, now there's LLMs that help, you know, that can write much better commit messages and document our code much better than we can, and sort of instantaneously with no work from us. And so you get it better and faster for, you know, essentially for free. So why is that not the way that version control works? So that's what we're trying to build, right? And so I'm interested in you know, the opinions of everybody. If you guys can talk to me after this or whatever, like, what do you want? What is frustrating in your workflows, right? But I think you can do that for anything, whatever company that you're in or whatever project that you're working on. I think it's very interesting to be easily frustrated, right? And notice those frustrations, because I think for this case with Git, I've written books on it, right? I'm very good at Git. Like, I understand how to do everything very clearly, but it's still, and so one would think, like, you become comfortable with it, and you don't question it, right? And you say, well, I haven't really known anything else, so I don't imagine something better. And it's nice sometimes to go back to first principles. This was a thing that it was like one of our core things at GitHub, was trying to think about a problem and go back to first principles and ask yourself, what are we really trying to accomplish at the end of this? And is this the best way of doing it? Let's imagine the best possible way of doing that, right? Like, can I click a button and just start working in my code and have it figure out for me, look at what I'm working on, and write commit messages and write documentation and commit them and push them and open a pull request, and I don't have to do anything? Like, is that possible, right? Like, what would be the best possible workflow? And then work backwards and say, how can I build that thing, right? Or how can I get closer to that thing? And I think doing that for whatever you're doing, whatever industry you're in, whatever problem you're working on, is always a really valuable exercise to say, let's go back to first principles, ask ourselves, what are we trying to accomplish every once in a while, right? And say, is that what we're doing, or are we doing it the way that it's been done before, just for the sake of that's the way it's always been done, right? Or that's what I'm always used to.
Yeah, that is an amazing superpower, right? Like, I think it's like we so often get blind to all the stuff that's around us, because it's always been done like that. And I think it requires like a special type of person to do that. On the one side, you need to be optimistic that you can solve it, because otherwise you'll just resign. You have like just a bunch of people like, oh, like everything here is so crappy, we're all doomed. And then on the other side, you need to be like also like have like the energy and like have the thing, like, ability to like abstract yourself from everything that you've done, right? Like, so this is when I talk to a lot of people like that start a new company, one thing that they always say is like, be very careful about experts, because they have like so much things learned how things are to be done. They're rarely the people that actually manage to disrupt something, because their way is set in like, how's the right way to do something. So how have you managed, right? Like, because you're about as expert as possible on Git, and you're saying like, hey, you abstract yourself and you go back to first principles, say like, how do we do this? So how do you manage this being an expert on the one side, but also having this like childlike naivete to like go back and say, hey, this stuff was cool then, but now it kind of sucks, let's do a better way. So how do you do that?
Yeah, I think the key is to be incredibly lazy. So I think this has always been...
We can all do that. I think like anybody here has problem being lazy is probably not going to be a good engineer or tech person.
Like I can do almost anything in Git. Like I've been into the internal. Like I understand how it works very very fundamentally, but I'm still very lazy, right? And so anytime that there's commands that I'm running and I'm like, why am this is taking time? This is frustrating. Like, I'd rather just be able to work or just be able to focus on this. I actually don't want to use Git, right? Like, I want Git to do everything. I want the tooling, right? Or I want somebody to sit next to me and kind of do all of that so I can just concentrate on working, on writing code and solving problems. Because Git doesn't solve problems, right? Git just sort of manages communication with other people that I'm trying to collaborate with. And GitHub is kind of the same way, right? Like, it's what I want to do is be incredibly lazy and not take time that isn't writing code. And everything in Git is not writing code. It's just facilitating communication or facilitating collaboration. And I just want to code and collaborate, and that's it, right? And I want to take away those. So I think, and this is from my first job out of high school was kind of the same thing, right? Like I came in, and I was a data processor for this trade show registration system, and I had to do database work, and I was doing the same. The whole team was doing the same thing over and over and over, and I was like, why am I doing the same thing every day? And I wrote a program to kind of do my job, and I ended up putting all of us kind of out of business because it automated everything that the entire department was doing. And then we had to figure out something else for all of us to do. But I mean, it's a good point, right? Like it's because I'm lazy, right? And I was like, I just don't want to do the same crap all the time. There is a way of, if I can figure out a logic, then you want to write something to make it better and to take that out of your lives, and so you can focus on something else. And nobody was fired, right? Like we all just did more stuff, did different stuff for the same company. And this is the core of it, right? Be lazy. Like, be as lazy as possible and just be like, I've done this. If you've done it 5 times, then write something to do it, right? Like don't do it again. And I think that's the fun part of software development, right? It's other than your time, it's kind of costless. Like my dad worked on cars, right? And I started working on cars when I was a kid because my dad was interested in it, and I was like, this is the same shit over and over and over. I don't want to replace a belt again. Like and it's expensive. You have to actually buy all this stuff, right? And you screw something up and it's expensive. Software, the beauty is that you can do anything, right? And it's all basically free. You buy a computer, you don't have to pay money every time you're writing a line of code or something. And so it's a great way of seeing a problem and saying, I don't want to do this again, and taking it out of your life and focusing on what's the next interesting thing.
Yeah, I think this is what you said, right? Like, so being lazy and replacing yourself. I've seen this many times, right? Like, so my former co-founder gave me this advice, like the best career advice is make yourself redundant, right? Like automate your job away, get other people empowered to do that. And a lot of people don't do that because they're afraid, like, oh, they're gonna fire me if I'm the only one who knows how to use this like magic command line script, and if I'm like automating that, then they have no need for me anymore. But what I've seen over and over again, and I'd love to have your perspective, is people automate themselves away, and what happens is they get promoted. So they're like, oh, you're ready for a much bigger scope because like obviously you've like contributed a lot, right? Like, so is that kind of like in line with what you're advising people to just basically automate as much as possible?
It is, yeah. I mean, actually for GitButler, like I want to do a next generation version control system where I'm looking at all these problems and trying to figure out what is the point of branching, what is the point of committing, like how can we like the point of the company, actually the sort of founding principle is to make sure that nobody ever has to read my book again, right? That I want to make my book completely obsolete because people they don't need to know all of this stuff, that there's something that's handling this for them. And I think that's fundamentally the right thing to do. And you probably get promoted. I definitely went up in the first company I was in because I put everybody out of a job, right? But I think people just find value in that, right? Because you're creating value in the company or creating value in the tool that you're doing, and so it is sort of a byproduct of it sometimes. But I think you have to be careful about that. You know, for people that are going up the ladder or whatever, make sure that you're still doing what you love doing. Like, I think a lot of people will try to become managers or something because they think that it's the next step or that they'll make more money but a lot of times, you know, I hate managing people. Like, I've essentially been like, I'm not going to manage anybody anymore because I'm not good at it and I don't enjoy it. Like, I like product, I like solutions, I like imagination, I like automation. Like, I enjoy these types of problems and not so much people problems and things like that. As much, right? And so be careful about, like, do what you want to be doing every day. Like, enjoy your job and find you know, value and beauty in it. That's if you can do that, like, I think that's a much nicer way to be happy. Like I said before, like, leaving a high-paying job to do GitHub, I was making much less. I was totally broke for a long time. And really struggling financially, but I loved what I was doing. Like, I loved my job every day, as opposed to before where I was more comfortable technically, but I really didn't enjoy the work that I was doing as much.
I think this is a fantastic advice. But like, I see, especially here as I come back to Cluj quite often, is a lot of times, like, the career path is you need to be a manager and you need to, like, every year, the most thing that matters is, like, how many people do you have in your span of control. You become an IC, you become a manager of 5 people, 10 people, 50 people, 100 people. And a lot of people, like, over time, they start hating their job, right? Like, a lot of us went into software development because we loved the craft, we loved the art of that. And then at the end, like, all you do is, like, managing spreadsheets and budgets. And right, like, I do manage a lot of spreadsheets and budgets nowadays. And I got to love that too, so I think I got lucky that I do enjoy that also very much. But I think it's, like, one of the best advices for people to read, like, look into your heart and see, like, hey, what do you enjoy doing? And as you're doing, like, optimizing for what you love, right? Like, when you say, like, hey, you don't love managing people, there's other people who can do that, but what you can do, very few people can do, right? Like, and that's I think, like, a good thing to.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, I don't want to say being a manager sucks, right? Like, it's just not what I love as much. And having tried it and having kind of been pushed into that position before, I know what I like, right? I know what I enjoy spending my time doing, but there's nothing better than a great product manager. There's nothing better than a great people manager, right? Like, it's actually it's one of the most valuable things that, like, I know that handful of people that I've worked with that I would love to work with again because they're so good at that thing. They're not necessarily super technical or, you know, whatever, but, like, they can, if you can make a team, I mean, there's a power in that, right? Like, if you can make a team gel and work well together and produce, you can do way more than an individual contributor can do. And I think it's massively powerful. It's just not my skill set, right? But if it is your skill set, or if you think you want, I don't want to push you away from that, right? Like, it is one of the most important, like, GitHub, you know, when I left, I mean, we were like 450 people, and it was actually very difficult to ship things because we had to transition from this individual contributor open source type model to really more of a little bit more command and control, right? But, like, more what is the company trying to do? We're like, where are we trying to go? What do we want to ship, right? And how do we get that done? And you need a good management structure in order to do that effectively. And we didn't have the tool set or the experience to do that. And it was very hard to find. We didn't have people in our networks that really knew how to do that. Once we did, I think they're much better at it now, right? Because I think Microsoft knows how to do that, and they're shipping at a rate that at 3,000 people now, where I would think that they'd, you know, if it was the GitHub that I left, would be shipping almost nothing because it's just it's all overhead and it's so difficult. And I think that they're shipping a lot and they're being very innovative. And I'm fascinated to watch it, right? Like, it can be really powerful. Like, how do you get groups of developers to do more than individual developers can do?
Yeah, no, I love that. All right, I think our time is up. Thank you so much for that chat. My takeaways is be lazy in a productive way. Contribute to open source code.
Put yourself out of a job.
And make sure that you do what you love.
Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much, Scott.
Thank you.